Welcome to the Closed-Minded Podcast, where we read with an open mind in order to close it again on something solid. This is episode 3, and I'm here with my good friend Josh to discuss a really fascinating book. Josh, thanks for being here.
Thanks, man. I'm excited to discuss this book too.
Yeah, so today we are talking about On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. It's written by Yale history professor Timothy Snyder, and just a couple bits of biographic info about the book. It's about 130 pages. It's really brief, really pithy. I think the first time I read it in an evening. It was published in March of 2017, and which was right after the inauguration of President Trump. And I think you'll see that definitely impacts a lot of the content in it and some of our discussion tonight. But Snyder is it's really fascinating because he's got these 20 lessons, which are really just riffs on a handful of insights that he has looking back on the 20th century, which was full of totalitarianism, despotism, mass murder, a lot of violence, and really a pretty horrific century in terms of the bloodiness and impact on the global system. So he looks back at that century and draws out a lot of lessons about looking forward into the 21st century and the time that we're in, how to avoid totalitarianism, subtle approaches and tactics on preventing a lot of things that were not prevented within the last 100 years. So I really enjoyed the book. I'll say that up front. I know you did as well. And really what we're going to do in terms of the format is just dive into a handful of these lessons that Snyder draws out, and we're going to talk through them and just use that as a riff for our discussion.
Yeah, I thought the book was really fascinating. I did a history major when I was in college, and so there was a lot of overlap for me just in my own educational experience. And I thought all of his points that were really, for the most part, driven out of historical realities were really, really very helpful. And one thing, I don't know what you thought about this, but one thing that's kind of interesting in a sort of an undertone of his book is sort of a one-for-one correlation that seemed to be going on in his mind. So, and I don't know if this was accidental or purposeful, but it seemed like some of these points, he was taking experiences that come out of the pages of history and saying, because these things happened, therefore it's likely that if you see something similar in the future, it will mean ipso facto totalitarianism on its way. Just as a big broad theme, did you get that sense? And do you even necessarily agree with what I'm saying?
I guess I'm not quite sure what you mean. Like, are you saying that the things that he's seeing and sort of using as a lens to look at stuff that's happening today is like he's too broad, or he's too quick to see totalitarianism hiding in the shadows? Well,
here's a good example. In one of his points, number 10, he talks about one of the really important things to prevent totalitarian governments from taking control is being really attentive to investigate and making a lot of attention to figure things out for yourself. And he makes several different kind of claims about sort of Soviet propaganda and things that happened in which Hitler likes to, take facts and twist them around until they become propaganda and you don't know what to believe anymore. And so, and kind of the impression that I was getting that he's saying, oh, see, Hitler did this, Stalin did this. Therefore, if you see this in the future by anybody, regardless of what political persuasion the person is who's doing it, then they must be intent on bringing a totalitarian government into play.
Yeah, I can see a little bit of that, and I think he maybe falls into that trap a number of times. But I think probably if you pressed him on it, he would say that really what his goal is just to be on your guard and to be aware of things that we think are maybe innocuous or not a big deal or pretty mild and tame really can turn into things that are pretty insidious if we're not careful, if we're not there to guard against the progression. And I think that's definitely true. I mean, there's always a threat, particularly from a government when it comes to our liberties, whether it's speech, religion, the use of our money, getting involved in wars. There's all sorts of examples where we should be on our guard to the slow encroachment of government power and authority. And I think, especially, if you look back on the 20th century, the term democide is somewhat new in my lexicon, but it's something that I've been reading about more and more and sort of awakening to, is that so much of the death and violence and destruction in the 20th century was directly attributable to centralized power and large governments, large military forces. Whether it's the quote unquote good guys or the bad guys. I mean, everybody is colored by that in some way. Nobody has a clean record. And so anytime that I see consolidation of power, it makes me nervous. And that's why I tend to want to fight against consolidation of power, centralization, anywhere that I see it, whether it's, people that are Republicans or Democrats. It doesn't really matter. Anywhere I see it, I'm wary of it.
Yeah, and especially the first 4 points were really, really helpful from Snyder in that vein. So the first 4 points: do not obey in advance, beware the one-party state, and take responsibility for the face of the world. In which he talks about taking responsibility for the face of the world. He's talking about symbols, pressurized symbols within society, and I think those are really, really helpful in thinking about how our liberties are lost, and thinking about how power grows within a state, a totalitarian state. The idea that when parties begin to sort of meld together until they become one party, then what happens is one source of control is gaining more and more power over various people. And maybe in money, maybe it's in political power, maybe it's in military power. Those are things in which to be very concerned about.
Yeah. In that point, he talks about just the way that the Soviet state transitioned with, the peasants who had more land and livestock than others were the first to lose what they had. When you're in a position where it's acceptable to portray your neighbor as a pig and not a human, then it makes it easier to take their land from them, because it's not a fellow child of God, it's not a fellow human, it's somebody who's just an animal who you can dismiss, you can rationalize away violence and oppression. And so he talks about the importance of these symbols in a culture, and pressures to conform, or an opportunity to display certain symbols of loyalty. And in the Soviet Union, I mean, the consequences of that were particularly stark and bloody with the collectivization. You have starvation that came to a lot of the Soviet peasantry. You've got millions of people in the Ukraine, Kazakhstan, the parent Russia, who died really horrible and humiliating deaths in the 30s. And by the end of it, people were butchering each other for meat. And so he says, you might one day be offered the opportunity to display symbols of loyalty. Make sure that such symbols include your fellow citizens rather than exclude them. And he mentions pins as even an example of that might seem innocent, but really they weren't. They were used in Nazi Germany to signify agreement with the party, and then, the swastika pins rose from that. And the interesting thing there is, for me, is that, reading this, of course, a lot of his examples from the 20th century are horrific. But he's, worried about a lot of stuff that are contemporary to Trump. He's worried about Trump being an authoritarian, about, people aligning themselves behind symbols like, make America great again, or, other pieces of rhetoric in the Trump campaign. And, there were a lot of things that I was concerned about, but in terms of our current political climate and cultural climate that we're in, a lot of these examples of places where we are pressured to conform and align ourselves with certain symbols and sort of virtue signal to everyone around us that, hey, I'm in line with what's currently culturally approved on issue X, Y, or Z. A lot of those things are leftist to my mind. Or if not leftist, then, sort of mainstream American pie, Americanism. So whether we're talking about wearing an American flag pin, if every politician is obligated to put on his American flag pin if he's walking around Congress or if he's on TV or doing an interview, and if he's not wearing his pin, he's going to be called out. And, that means that you don't support the troops or whatever. And the irony is that, it's currently yes to the American flag, but it's no to the Confederate flag, which is sort of ridiculous to me, because I think basically all of the arguments that you can make about the Confederate flag, which are legitimate, also apply to the American flag, depending on what time period you're looking at. I've heard it said, if you just Google, do a Google image search on the American flag, well, you can find all sorts of examples of unpalatable, unapproved, looked down upon cultural and historical scenarios today that are just as toxic as what we see with the Confederate flag and where that has been in our culture. So a lot of it is just, it depends on who's in power, and there's a lot of pressure to conform, and I tend to be a contrarian by nature. And so if somebody says,
no.
So if somebody says, do this, my natural inclination is to be like, no, I'm going to do the opposite.
This is a really interesting point for me, because on point number 4, at that point, I had basically been yes, absolutely yes, agreeing kind of to everything, and really seeing it in almost exactly the same way that you're talking about. So from my kind of reading of American politics right now, and certainly this is true on the right and on the left, there is pressure to maintain sort of symbolic loyalty things. But, and this is the fascinating thing, and I don't think that this is where Snyder, certainly it's not where Snyder is ending up, because he ends up towards the end of this being very sort of anti-Trump, and sort of like maybe sometimes even blatantly, if not aggressively sort of progressive in some of his viewpoints. But at this point, I had really almost seen, especially point 4 and the pressurized symbols, to be exactly like you're talking about, primarily coming pressure from the left. And it was reassuring to me on one level, because as I got through the book and I realized that I think Snyder takes kind of some different political positions than I have on these levels, and on many of these points, I agree completely. And
on the principle of it, right? If
not, on the principle of it,
if not
exactly.
His particular application.
That's right. But it reaffirmed for me that I think in a lot of our American political conversation, people on the left and people on the right, we have a lot more in common than we often realize that we do. We kind of get presented, and we're kind of in some ways encouraged to polarize ourselves. But what tends to happen is we are looking at people on the other side of the political spectrum, as we've talked about through the Alan Jacobs book, how to think as the repugnant cultural other. And so we are seeing them and really as if their viewpoints need to be not just discounted but obliterated. And yet the principles of it we actually agree on, and we're at the same starting point.
Yeah, I think that's where some of the overlap with Jacobs is really great. That's episode 1 for anybody who's listening. But I think what this illustrates here is that we both find broad agreement with Snyder in a lot of the principles that he's describing and explaining and sort of looking back on the 20th century to find examples of. And I think that's really important, even if we don't see all the same parallels in 2018. If anything, we kind of, in a lot of ways, see the opposite parallels, or at least we see different emphases and different points of danger in terms of those issues cropping up again in the 21st century. But the fact that we agree with him on the principle is, I think, really important to highlight. And that connects to Jacobs in the sense that he talks about the really extreme importance of thinking with different groups of people. And so I think there's immense value in finding, principles that we can find common agreement on, and then listen to each other about how we see that surfacing in 2018 and onward, and getting an understanding of why you see it one way and maybe I see it a different way. But we both are applying the same principle. We both are trying to guard against the same risks, the same excesses. And so I think that's what makes this book really important, is that a lot of the lessons pretty much everybody can agree on. And then I think if we can sort of get in the same room and get a better understanding of each other for how we apply those in today, there's a lot of value there and a lot of room for growth.
Well, in a moment here, I'm going to ask you which one of these points resonated the most with you. But for me, I think number 17 was really the one that stuck with me very well. Number 17, he says, listen for dangerous words. And so a couple of the kind of words that he highlights is being very alert to the use of words like extremism and terrorism, not because those words don't mean anything, but those words can be used in ways in which they can become excuses for doing really kind of anything you want. So, for example, if you even just think about the Patriot Act, and that was obviously an exceptional situation, but after 9/11 and when the Twin Towers fell, it was a terroristic act upon our country. It was an extreme situation. And so one of the things that happened was the Patriot Act, because we wanted to collect data to protect ourselves from terrorism. And yet it was a moment in which those words then, it was sort of like a first step down a long journey. And now you can easily see places where the fear of extremist behavior, which is actually a really difficult word to define. What is extreme, right? Because it's relative. Something is only extreme in relation to something else, right? And in comparison to something else, it doesn't have any real meaning. But extremism can be used then to kind of excuse behavior that's, once in a lifetime, that we'd never do this except for this extreme moment. And I think they were seeing that actually. We were talking off air a little bit about the Mueller investigation that's ongoing with Trump. It has gone over for almost 2 years now, where they've been investigating whether or not Trump colluded with the Russians in some way. And this entire sort of tribunal has changed its direction, the things that it was investigating, the people it was investigating almost several times now. And sort of the foundational assumption, right, that gave power to that tribunal, to the FBI, and of course there's nothing wrong with making sure investigating things that need to be investigated. But a lot of the language that was used is this is an exceptional moment. These are potential terrorist activities, Russian involvement in our election. I mean, it was an extreme act of cyber terrorism. These were all things that were being said that were sort of dangerous words, if you will, that were used to justify limiting either our freedoms, or in the Patriot Act, or even now to do something that's maybe something like the Mueller investigation.
Yeah, and what's interesting there is that, let me kind of affirm both sides of the political aisle on that issue at different times. And I think what's reasonable has changed over the last year and a half to 2 years. But, initially after the election, I mean, we had a significant upset. Nobody expected Trump to win.
Right.
Everyone expected that Hillary had it in a bag. And then when it didn't happen, there was a lot of uproar. There was immediately a lot of speculation about Russian influence. And we've basically had a steady stream of what I think turned out to be pretty minor stories about Russian involvement, Russian attempts to influence or quote unquote hack the election. And I hate that term because it's a catch-all that can mean anything, and people just tend to apply whatever their current political understanding or their political allegiance is to that word to either believe it or discount it. But I think initially at the very beginning, it was perfectly legitimate to call for investigation and to express concern on the state of our democracy, whether it was being threatened by authoritarianism or by other countries meddling. I think those are perfectly legitimate questions to ask in a moment of great uncertainty and great fear and great upheaval. The good news, which to me is good from a political perspective, but also just about the health of the American system, is that a lot of those fears ended up being overblown and not really important, which I think is a good thing, because I don't want American democracy to be threatened. I don't want the system to be meddled with by foreign powers. And fortunately, I don't think that really happened. That has not ended up bearing any fruit in terms of legitimate reporting, legitimate threats. Basically, we had, a few Facebook ads and some memes by Russians that tried to, influence people, which really wasn't that big of a deal.
I don't know. I fell for it.
Yet. Anyways.
Wait, Russian?
Yet. Only one word. But yeah, one of the things that, because you said you were going to ask me about what sort of impacted me the most, or what my main takeaway is number 18, which corresponds closely to 17 that we just finished discussing, which is he talks about modern tyranny being terror management. And he says when the terrorist attack comes, or, whatever the event is, remember that authoritarians exploit such events in order to consolidate power. The sudden disaster that requires the ends of checks and balances, the dissolution of opposition parties, the suspension of freedom of expression, the right to a fair trial, and so on. He says that's the oldest trick in the Hitlerian book. Do not fall for it. And I really like the name of this lesson, which is Be Calm When the Unthinkable Arrives. I think this has been a theme, particularly in the last maybe 10 or 15 years, is what I would call the politics of emergency. And it's really harmful and dangerous and damaging. And I see it play out in a lot of ways. They really have, these pre-exist Trump. So I know there was a lot of concern about the authoritarianism of Trump. And honestly, I was concerned about that prior to the election. I don't think that it has been borne out by reality, which is good, because that would be a problem if you were a major authoritarian. And I don't know if that's because he's just been constrained, or if he's, made strategic decisions not to be that way, even maybe though his inclinations are to be that way. Who knows? I don't know the reasons why. I just know that the reality is it hasn't come to pass, and I'm happy about it. But even pre-Trump, I'm just thinking about things like TARP, which is the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which came out of the financial crisis in 2008. Along with the bailouts. We had billions and billions of dollars that were basically created out of thin air to save these industries that, in my opinion, should have been allowed to fail. And we completely changed the rules with how we handle private enterprise in this country, particularly if you're big and well connected to the political powers that be. We had Dodd-Frank legislation that came out of it, which again was supposedly this attempt to protect consumers and to guard against, risky behavior in the banking system. And really, from everything that I've read, it's a total disaster. It's a grand statist power grab and regulatory encroachment on small community banks. And it's just been a huge problem in terms of crony capitalism and limiting liberties of private institutions. You've got the TSA, which is now, sits on top of the whole airport security system. Everybody knows the TSA is a joke, and yet we've got our liberties encroached every time we go through security for what is essentially a farce. Nobody thinks that the TSA makes anybody safer, but there it is, and they're a government agency. The CFPB,
and will now never go away.
Yeah, I know. The CFPB, which is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I have even had some personal fallout with that, with some of my own investments that I won't get into, but that's been a personal source of contention recently. But basically, that gives the government pretty much carte blanche authority to destroy a company if they see fit. They can take over a company for just about any reason if they decide that it's at risk or too big to fail, or they're making poor decisions. Just incredible encroachment on authority that the government has no business wielding, and yet it's all justified in the name of protecting people, and in the wake of an emergency. We've got gun control stuff being debated today in the wake of school shootings. And people are talking about confiscating weapons, and that's a whole separate discussion about whether that's people just bloviating, or whether that's legitimately a policy proposal that people want to see happen or not, or whether it's just insanity that's being used to justify fundraising for the NRA. There's a whole lot of range of opinion on that, but the point is that people are talking about significant encroachments on a constitutional amendment because of this emergency and the politics of emergency. And then finally, the terrorism watch list. The government has these lists of people. Nobody knows how they get on there, and they can't travel. They're not given a reason why. They can't challenge it in court. There's no official explanation given. Their name just shows up on a list. Nobody knows why, and they're hamstrung in terms of travel. And that's a huge problem. It doesn't impact a large number of people comparatively, but that's a significant problem for the government to be wielding that sort of authority with no accountability whatsoever. So, those are just some examples that I thought of off the top of my head when I was considering this. But I think it's really important for a citizenry to, again, quoting his lesson here, number 18, be calm when the unthinkable arrives. And I would say, do not let authoritarians exploit tragic events to consolidate power. I think that is a significant theme that anybody can get on board with, regardless of your political persuasion.
Sure. And it's, very evident that happened in history. You just have to think about, even the Reichstag fire as a perfect illustration for the Nazis to come in and say, oh, this is a state of emergency. Look at this fire set by the communists. We have to do something to take over. And then essentially Germany stayed in a state of emergency for the next 12 years as they tried to take over the world. So
yeah, that's unbelievable to me. 12 years in a state of emergency.
Right. We have to be here or else everything is going to fall apart as we attack Czechoslovakia and Poland and now France. And so one thing I think that's connected. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, he brings in even a contemporary example, which is the way that Putin rose to power in Russia. Even, as recently as 2014, when, and as Putin is rising and gathering authority and influence, he abolishes or eliminates private television, elected regional governorships, which all of this stuff was enabled by the way that he and his government managed terrorism, whether it was real or questionable or not. He used those scenarios as a means of consolidating power. And it's pretty scary.
Yeah. I think one of his other points that's intimately connected with the previous two is number 9, where he talks about being kind to our language. He talked about several different things in regards to this, but one of the things he talked about is avoiding pronouncing phrases everyone else does, and to think about your own way of speaking, and it's sort of like an intellectual stand against what everyone is saying. But he connects it then to television, to kind of mainstream media, the constant barrage of viewpoints that are all essentially really the same viewpoint and political language, and sort of this attempt to stand against the political situation, but it's not clear that anything is actually being resolved. It's just sort of one talking head after the next talking head after the next talking head. But the one thing that they all seem to have in common, which relates at this point to the previous one, is that everyone seems to sort of be outraged about something. So there's some sort of unbelievable behavior either by this politician or by the president, or can you believe this? Can you believe this tweet by the president? And things kind of, but everyone's saying exactly the same thing until we can even barely understand what is even being said. So one of the illustrations he talks about is, this is, I think, a brilliant example, but each story on televised news is breaking until it's displaced by the next breaking news story. And so we're hit by wave upon wave upon wave, but never actually see the ocean. And in some ways, it's sort of like the politics of not necessarily emergency, but the politics of outrage, which is a different way to constantly keep us so occupied with our fears, if you want, or occupied with one way of looking at the world, that we can't even individually think outside of that box that's been created for us by our political affiliations or by the talking heads on television or whoever.
Yeah, I mean, I really think the media has abdicated their responsibility in the wake and running up to this election. I mean, the fact that nobody saw this coming, nobody was apparently able to diagnose why it was that so many millions of people were willing to vote for this guy, Donald Trump, which, let me just state for the record, I voted against Donald Trump. I also voted against Hillary Clinton. So there's no love lost for her with me on that side either. But the fact
you
that
and
the
me
media,
both, brother.
the fact that the media did not understand what most of America was wanting, and really still doesn't. And then the way that they've gone and reported on the Trump administration has been really shameful in the last year, because there have been plenty of legitimate reasons and angles for reporting with honesty and integrity and consistency on the Trump administration. And yet, to the extent that that exists at all, it's completely drowned out in the noise of the hysteria over every little tweet, or the way that he moves his hands at a press conference, or, what some porn star might have said about some affair that he may have had that nobody is surprised about, because, of course, everybody knew who Donald Trump was before he was elected. So, half of this stuff is just not news. And so when you have so much hysteria over all this stuff, then when there's a legitimate news angle of something that's dangerous or concerning or potentially totalitarian about something that Trump may be doing,
you can't even hear it.
Yeah, you can't hear it. It's the media has cried wolf so many times and has revealed themselves to be have so much hatred of Trump that and a complete unhinged, biased hatred of him that it's really hard to sort of pull out the serious reporting from the rest of it. And so it makes it really hard to track what is important and what is not in terms of what's actually happening in an administration, because all they focus on is the celebrity, stuff that should be on TMZ and not CNN.
And to the point, what's dangerous about that is that if Trump moves in even more authoritarian, totalitarian activity, it's like the public won't even be able to hear it or understand that, because they've already been discounting the credibility of the media up till this point, because they've been so bad in their coverage of Trump. So not just to say that they've been biased in their coverage against Trump, and 90% of, that was a recent statistic that I've seen, that 90% of all news stories coming out of the media are negative about Trump. So it's not just that their reporting of Trump is bad, but whenever there's a possibility for potentially important reporting, if Trump moves in tries to consolidate power under one party or something, no one is going to be paying attention.
Right.
And that is problematic.
And, I mean, on the flip side of that, at the same time, as much as I have higher expectations for what the media has really done over the last year, at the same time, I'm not surprised because, I mean, Donald Trump is a dumpster fire. And so he's there, and he's, there's a lot that you can cover that's just pure ratings gold. And I totally get why the media covers him the way that they do. It's wrong that they cover him that way, but I totally understand it. And I think it's also an implication or a reflection of, the visual media that, our entire system is built on. Snyder had a comment about, television, about how it has challenged political language by conveying images. And, we just have this succession from one frame to another. It can hinder a sense of resolution. Before the current crisis is cold, the next one has lit up and is now ready for you to observe and watch and to get passionate about. And, you'd mentioned before, every story is breaking until it's replaced by the new one. And so we're hit by wave upon wave, but we never see an end to it. And so it's interesting. The thing that I immediately thought of is Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, which is a really fascinating book about the way that medium has changed over the last 200 years, from a society that was rooted in a text-based, oratory-based culture for consuming and communicating media. And it has slowly shifted first into a radio and audio world, which still retained a lot of integrity and value, but has slowly shifted into this age of television where it's all visual media. And everything he describes, that Snyder describes, aligns perfectly with what Postman describes about the TVization of our culture and all of the downsides that have come with that, academically, intellectually, entertainment-wise. I mean, everything is entertainment. And so, there's no other goal to be pursued besides entertain the eyeballs in front of your screen. And when that drives everything, you get a lot of crap and a lot of chaff and a lot of wasted effort and stuff that is not edifying. So I think that's a really big problem that really has nothing to do with Trump, but is just a current reality today in 2018.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we should probably wrap it up there. There are a handful of other points that are just really fantastic. A lot of really good pithy wisdom found in these 20 lessons that Snyder draws out from the 20th century and applies to today. If it's felt at all like we are super critical of him, I don't think that that's the case. We definitely have some disagreement with the current applications, but this is a really valuable book for anybody on either side of the political spectrum. Really good and helpful for understanding history, as well as for understanding the time that we're in, particularly if you can think through these things with people that are in other camps and that have other perspectives. And we did that indirectly in the sense that we were sort of on opposite sides a lot of times with Snyder. So I found it really edifying. I know that you did. Highly recommended. It's really short. You can find it on Amazon. If you go to closemindedpodcast.com/3, that's the show notes page. We'll have a link to the book there. And I will also post some quotes straight from the book that are particularly powerful or edifying or relevant, that are worth a read. So highly recommend that. Any other closing thoughts, Josh?
Yeah, just read the book. It's worth it.
Cool. All right, well, that'll do it for episode 3. Again, closemindedpodcast.com/3, and we will see you next time. I wish upon you truth, and all you feel is doubt. I hope you know that an open mind still knows when to shut things out. I wish upon you a brave heart that will always